Hey, good morning. Good morning, Horizon Church. Good morning, Estella. Good morning, Pat, and anybody else that is plugged in. So, hi, fellas. Don't know if you saw or can see this thumbnail. This is Rembrandt's picture of the storm at sea from, you guys remember learning Sunday school days. So this is probably one of the first lessons that we learn in Sunday school about Jesus, how Jesus calmed the sea. And great story in the Bible about Jesus. This is I've been giving a lot of thought and reading a lot and studying a lot and praying a lot about this whole concept of hi Kathy, of change and transformation. Just this idea that how does that happen? How do we become the people we want to be? How do we overcome some of the garbage and some of the bad habits and some of the ugliness that's in our lives? How do we do that? Good morning, Fred. Hi, Miriam. And talking about this change. And Tuesday, when we talked, I talked about the fact that that we are shaped by what we love. And such an important idea, such a significant idea. And I want to actually think more about that when it comes to actually people. And I learned something in the process of some of the reading I'm doing about this concept that we're shaped by the people that we love. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that storm at sea. That is the story that's in the Bible. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a couple stories in the Bible about storms on the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Galilee. I had a chance, Don and I, we were actually at the Lake of Galilee back in 1987 when I was in seminary. We did a semester in Israel. I know I've told you this before, but it's just a big lake. I think 2 to 3 miles across and about 5 miles long. You can easily see from one end to the other. I got a chance to fish. I took a telescoping fishing pole in my suitcase. And so when we were there, got a chance to fish, and I caught what the fish that is typically called St. Peter's fish. I think traditionally it's the fish that Peter caught that had a coin in his mouth. Anyway, so I had a great time. But so we were there at the the Lake Galilee, and in the Bible there are multiple stories about storms on this lake. And I know, guys, if you go back to your Sunday school days, or even maybe messages that talked about the fact that because of the geography on the eastern side of the lake, sorry, my phone's dinging. I was going to turn it off. The eastern side of the lake, there are cliffs that pretty much drop down. There is a little bit of a beachy area, but they pretty much drop down straight. So storms can roll in over that terrain and change the weather pretty rapidly and pretty dramatically. And it lends itself to people out on the lake being surprised by storms. And that happened a couple times in the Gospels. And I never noticed this before. I think this is really, really important when it comes to this idea that we're going to talk about. All of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John as well, all of them have a story about a storm on Lake Galilee, and most of them have this story very early in their accounts. In Matthew, it's in chapter 8, which is right after the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And in Matthew 8 already, there's this storm, which is really right at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. In Mark, it's in chapter 4, and in Luke, it's in chapter 8 as well. I think chapter 8 or 6. So all of the gospel writers have this story about the storm right at the beginning. Yes, Estella, I just actually last night, I got to listen to Donna's preschool lesson yesterday, where she was talking about fishing and she told the story about Peter catching the coin. Probably why I was thinking about it. But anyway, this is a great story. You should read it because there's some details that I think are revealing and significant. It talks about the fact that Jesus is asleep in the boat, in the front of the boat, and this storm comes up, and Jesus continues to sleep. And the disciples respond. Now, this is an interesting question. The disciples wake Jesus up, and they say, "Don't you care that we're going to drown?" Now, that's an important question that they're actually asking him. Don't you care about us? Don't you care that we're going to drown? Obviously, this is at the beginning of his ministry. He's just forming a relationship with the disciples, and it becomes apparent that the disciples do not know Jesus very well. So they ask that question, "Don't you care?" And then as the story develops, Jesus stands up and he shouts to the storm, and there's an immediate calm on the lake. And each of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all say that the disciples were terrified when they saw Jesus calm the storm. And they respond by saying, "Who is this man?" And that's a really significant question because there's this sense of they just don't know who Jesus is. And it's appropriate at that point in the ministry. They're still discovering, they're still learning who Jesus is. And they are in a relationship with Jesus, a relationship of student rabbi. He's the teacher, they're the students. And I don't know about you, but if you think about your teachers, there are probably a handful of teachers that you really loved, but most of them, you wouldn't look back and say, "Yeah, I love those teachers." Maybe they were good teachers, maybe they weren't, but they were just teachers. That's the relationship that Jesus has with the disciples at this point in this ministry. They don't know him. They don't know who he is. They respond that way when they see what he does. They're terrified, and they respond by saying, "Who is this man?" And that question they asked when they said, "Don't you care?" It's so revealing that early on, they just don't know who Jesus is. Now, what's really interesting, and I never noticed this before, I never paid attention to this before, there is a second story about Jesus calming a storm. This one happens much later. In Matthew, it's in chapter 14. And as far as timing, there's really no way for us to know, but you can easily assume that the second story takes place a year later, maybe more, who knows. So by now, Jesus has spent significant time with the disciples. They now know who he is. There's been all kinds of conversations. And it's not just what they know about him. It's the fact that there is this growing affection that they have for Jesus. They're actually starting to grow to love him, not just look at him as a teacher, teaching them facts. So the second story in Matthew chapter 14, in this one, Jesus is not in the boat. Jesus has sent the disciples ahead. He says, "You guys get in the boat, cross the lake, and I'll catch up with you later." He wanted to spend a night alone in prayer. So the disciples are in the boat in the middle of the lake, middle of Galilee, Lake Galilee, and a storm catches them off guard. And it's a horrific storm. And the gospel writers, I think John tells this story, John 6-ish, something like that. Might be wrong. I can't remember. Anyway, the disciples are terrified of the storm. And they are in the boat. The boat's being swamped. They're doing what they can to stay afloat, stay alive. And in this bizarre encounter, this bizarre experience, Jesus comes walking across the water. And when the disciples see him, They're in the boat, they see him, and they respond exactly like any of us would. This is not an ordinary occurrence. And they respond in fear to what they're seeing, and thinking, it's a ghost, who knows what it is. But this is really fascinating to me, because this time around, Jesus responds to them by saying, hey, don't be afraid, it's me. Now think about that for a second, that simple sentence, don't be afraid, it's me. There's this sense in which Jesus is calming them just by saying, hey, don't worry. This is what you say to somebody when you are calming them with your presence, when they know you and they trust you. And that's what Jesus is saying this second time around. Don't be afraid, it's me. And then here's what happens. This is marvelous, because Peter responds to Jesus by saying, Jesus, if it's really you, call me to you. And it's Jesus and Peter in this really intimate moment where Peter is saying, Jesus, I want to be with you. And Jesus does. He says, come to me. Peter gets out. In Matthew chapter 14, Peter starts walking across the water, but then we all know how the story goes. The story, Matthew tells us that Peter took his eyes off Jesus and he started to sink. He started paying attention to the wind and the waves, and he started to sink. And Jesus had to grab him, rescue him, and then pull him into the boat. And what's so significant this second time around, when you compare these two stories, in the early story, you have the disciples who really don't yet know Jesus. They don't know who he is. They respond by saying they're terrified of him. And they say, who is this man? Who is he? And the second time around, it's exactly the opposite, that Jesus actually calms them with his presence. There's no more fear of who he is. He calms them with his presence. And there's this great story about Peter who sees Jesus, and he, in essence, says, Jesus, call me. I want to be with you. And Jesus does. And as long as Peter has his eyes on Jesus, all is well. It's when he takes his eyes off of Jesus and starts thinking about the storm. And here's what I want to think about for a couple minutes. You and I in the church, we make a big deal about belief, and we should, what we believe. But when you think about the disciples, and if you think about just pure belief, what it is that we believe about Jesus, think about the fact that Judas, for example, Judas saw the exact same things that all the other disciples did. He had all the right beliefs about Jesus, believed the right things, and yet in the end, he ended up betraying him. And this is so important for us, for you and I. Belief alone, kind of just listing our beliefs, is not enough to change a human being. Change is going to come because of who we love, not because of what we believe. Who we love is far more important to our lives than what it is we believe. And this is why I think there's so much struggle in the church, in life in general, especially when it comes to change, because a lot of us think, well, I believe all the right things. I believe Jesus was the Son of God, and we might list the things we believe. Belief alone is never going to be enough to impact our lives. The impact in our lives comes from who we love. And you can see this so clearly in these two stories about a storm. In the first storm, you have these disciples who didn't even know Jesus, and so they're terrified. By the time the second one rolls around, it's his presence that actually calms them. And you have this wonderful moment when Peter very affectionately and with great devotion is saying to Jesus, call me, I want to be with you. And Jesus does. And there's this miraculous episode of Peter walking on the water. So the question for you and I really becomes a question of love. Not, this is so, not romantic love, but a love that is based on just deep affection and trust. And this is why this is so important. When it comes to how you and I are going to change our lives, we are most impacted by the people that we let into our lives. And the people we let into our lives are the people that we love, that we trust. You and I can sense this when we're with people, even people that we might know really, really well, but we don't love them and we don't trust them. You know that we have barriers up. We can sense it. We're unwilling to say certain things. We're unwilling to get into conversations in which we might have to reveal ourselves. There's one of the things that happens, and I see this a lot of times there are families that the only people that they let into their lives are other family members. And there are all kinds of boundaries for everybody else. And so we experience this concept. We know what it's like to kind of let somebody into our lives. The only way that Jesus is going to have an impact on us is if we love him and trust him and let him into our lives, believing certain things about him. That doesn't mean a whole lot. It really doesn't change us. The Bible talks about the fact that even the demons believe. Judas believed. He saw the same things that everybody else did. But for whatever reason, Judas ultimately decided that he didn't love Jesus. He didn't trust him. And it's that loving, trusting relationship that allows a person to have an impact in our lives. So for you and I, people who, I don't think you'd be here. I don't think you'd be showing up if you didn't have some interest in having Jesus impact you and change your life. Same with me. But the only way he's going to do that is if we decide that we love him and that we're in this trusting relationship with him. I think we all believe that Jesus loves us, but the question becomes, do we love him? Do we trust him? So this is so important because we are shaped by what we love, by who we love. And the only way that Jesus is going to have an impact in our lives and on our lives is if we learn to love him and trust him, because it's then that we let him into our lives. So it'd be a good question for you and for me and for all of us to kind of ask a question about, where we are with Jesus and what's the relationship that we have with him. So it's just so important for us as we kind of work our way through this idea of, how do we change? So let me pray, and then, oh no, I'm sorry, Pat. We will certainly pray for Kobe, for you and Kobe. Yeah, it is hard. It's a tough thing. I was just talking to a doctor yesterday about our pets, and it's just not right that that they don't live longer. So let me pray. God, I want to thank you for your faithfulness to us. God, I know that that all of us are here and engaged because we have this genuine desire to see you impact our lives, change our lives, help us to overcome some of the stuff some of the ugliness and some of the stuff that we'd like to overcome. God, I pray that we'd be people who grow our affection for you, grow our trust for you. Pray, God, that we'd be people who genuinely desire to be in a kind of a loving, trusting relationship with you. We trust you to do the very best for us and want the very best for us. And at the same time, God, that we are choosing to let you into our lives. And it's then, God, that you can do your work in us. I pray for all of us, God. I pray for Pat and Hank and for the difficult decision that they face. I pray, God, you'd make them wise. Pray, God, for everybody who is continuing to struggle with just all of the consequences of what we're going through now. Pray, God, that we be people who are going through this, trusting you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Alrighty, everybody. So thank you all very much. And hope you guys have a great day. And love you all. And take care. Hope you guys have a good day. Goodbye.